Welcome back everyone. Today I will show you how I made this A-line indigo dye dress. But before we jump into the sewing part, I thought it would be nice to show you some of my thoughts and design process at the background of this dress. So, I have been a long-term admirer of the Indian fashion, both traditional and modern. So much so that, in fact, I have multiple Pinterest boards filled with inspiration for potential future projects. Today's project's inspiration comes from this online store, where every single one of these dresses I would buy in a heartbeat. But alas, they don't deliver outside India, so there's only one option left for me. I'll have to make it myself. And luckily enough, I have the perfect fabric for it. This beautiful cotton I accidentally bought off Facebook Marketplace. How can you accidentally buy something? Well, word of advice, don't browse Facebook Marketplace after midnight. So this type of white patterns on an indigo blue background fabric is a very traditional fabric in Hungary, and in fact in this region of Europe, whose origins go back to the 17th century, when travelers from India introduced the technique of resist dyeing and the indigo plant to Europe. The way it's made is very similar to block printing, where the dyer uses wooden block patterns that he dips in wax to create the designs on the textile, so when the fabric is dyed with the indigo, it won't dye the wax-covered parts, leaving those areas white. Later, the wax is melted off with some chemicals, revealing the pattern underneath. If you would like to learn more about the blueprinting technique, as it's called, I will link some videos down below, as well as the workshop my textile was originally made in, where they still use these traditional techniques. Now that you know more about the history of this fabric, I'm sure you can appreciate the beautiful irony of me making a modern Indian dress that was inspired by the Western fashions using a traditional European fabric that originally was inspired by the Indian indigo dye textiles. I just love the mix of cultures and the modern with the traditional so much that I actually already made 2 dresses based on this principle a couple of years back. Looking at my inspirational photo, I saw no darts on the front, so I thought wise to draft my own bodysloper pattern for the very first time, using this video as a guide. I was a little bit nervous, because I usually like to make my patterns by draping, so I made sure to make a mock-up and a fit test before I cut my fabric. I pinned and sewed the seams together, except for the middle seam. Then I tried it on and marked where I want the middle fold to be, then adjusted the neckline and armholes until I was happy with it. I did this by marking the new curves while wearing the bodice, then cutting it out, folding it in half, and transferring the new shape onto the other side too, so it would be symmetric. Before I could go on to making the facing, I would have to finish the shoulder seam, so I cut the seam allowance down, folded it back twice and felled it down by hand. I also folded the middle seams back twice, on both sides. made the facing from this pink cotton fabric by laying the outer garment onto it, tracing the lines and adding an inch thickness. I made 3 of these pieces, 2 for the front and 1 for the back. I pinned and sewed them together. Then I sewed them to the right side of the fabric. Then, notching the seam allowance, I turned it inside out and understitched it. Unfortunately, I don't have any pink threads, so I used the same blue as for the main fabric. Then I turned the facing inside, and turning the raw edges in, I felled it down. I did the same thing to the armholes, but here instead I used the pink bias tape I already had. To make the decorative loops in the middle, I cut a long strip of pink fabric. I folded it half and sewed lengthwise. Then, using a strong thread, I turned it inside out. I ironed the tube flat, then I cut little 4 cm pieces of it. Using a ruler, I marked out where I want my little loops to be. Then I transferred those markings onto a piece of pink bias tape. I should have used twill tape or something stronger than a bias tape here, but to be honest, it did the job. Then I basted the loops on with my sewing machine. In retrospect, I should have basted it with hands, but I was in a bit of a hurry because I wanted to finish by the weekend. Then I sewed both sides of the bias tape down to my fabric and removed the basting. Then, folding it twice back to cover the raw edges, I sewed it down with a sewing machine. After another round of fitting, where I determined where I wanted to close, I also sewed the pieces together, laying the loop side on top of the plain side. At this point I realized that the bodice from the outside doesn't look so interesting. Other than the pink loops, there is nothing really on it. So I decided to change the bias tape around the armhole to a different blue print fabric from a darker color. To make a longer continuous bias strip, I laid the fabric strips on top of each other in a 90-degree angle and sewed across. Then I attached the bias around the armhole, sewed it down, folded it back twice, and I felt down the other end by hand. To make the skirt part, I cut off a 2-meter piece from my fabric. To gather it, I sewed 2 lines straight down the top edge. Then I pulled on the bobbin threads to gather the skirt down to the required length. I actually realized I wanted the skirt to sit around waist height, so I marked the line where I wanted it to sit and I pinned and sewed it there. I still had some selvage left from the bodice to turn it back twice and finish the raw edges from the inside. Then I attached the zippers. Because it was only one continuous strip of fabric that I gathered down, I only had one opening left for the pocket to go. But one pocket is still better than no pocket. As a last step, I hemmed the skirt by folding it back to a previously marked line. And that's it. Final thoughts. I'm actually really happy with this dress. I think it turned out quite cute. I also really love this fabric. And I'm really happy that I still have like 8 meters left of it. So yeah, I expect to see some more projects come out of it. I'm still experimenting with the format of these videos, so if you like this little intro behind the scenes design process thing, please let me know down in the comments below. It would be really helpful.